This is Edwardian Britain. The remarkable years at the turn of the 20th century.
It's an incredible period. It's the shaping of our modern era. We wouldn't be where we are without the Edwardians.
And now, for the first time, in colour.
History tends to be about the rich, the famous, the powerful, whereas these people, they're ordinary people. This footage is about them.
Britain was the richest country in the world, on the back of the hard work of men, women and children.
We often think of the working classes very drab in old clothes, in black and white, and it shows what they did have, that they led these lives of colour and of richness.
It's an age when workers were allowed to enjoy life after the long austerity of the Victorians.
Look at those colours, gorgeous. People out to enjoy themselves, families out together.
But it's also a time of conflict, as workers and women demand new rights.
The use of three colours, purple, white and green, and everybody knew what that stood for. 3 words, votes for women.
Change did come, but on a scale nobody could foresee.
And this is incredibly poignant because it's filmed just 2 weeks before the start of the war, and that war is going to change everything.
Life in Edwardian Britain began with the death of Queen Victoria in 1901. Millions lined London streets to witness the funeral. Behind Victoria's coffin rode her son and successor, Edward VII, the last king to give his name to an era. With a new century and a new king, the nation now looked forward to change. The summer of 1902, on the day of Edward VII's coronation, the nation takes to the streets to celebrate, like this one here in Accrington, shown in colour for the first time.
See, this one just fascinates me to see it because the pageantry of it from Accrington, it's just another kind of northern, kind of old industrial town. And when we look at the efforts that has been put into the costume, the sort of expense that would have gone into this parade.
It's bright to the point of being blindingly bright, but that's part of spectacle. In the absence of TV, in the absence of the internet and a computer screen on every phone, this is the spectacle that brings people together.
When you look at the whole history of the Edwardian and Victorian period, people were on the streets all the time. They would parade for temperance, they would parade for the Whit Walks, they would parade for Catholic processions, Protestant processions. So they paraded massive big banners, huge pageantry, dressed up, and it was a spectacle. And this coronation procession would have lasted about 2 hours.
I think what we're seeing here is a film of how conscious people are of what's happening in the rest of the British Empire. How people have absorbed descriptions of empire from newspapers, from popular culture and so on. Remember, this is only 3 months after the end of the Boer War. There will have been a lot of talk about Africans. And I think this film reflects how globalised thinking was at this moment in time.
These are people in the absence of having sufficient people of colour black themselves up to include those people of colour as part of the British story. So they want the British story to be authentic, and for it to be authentic, it has to include people of the empire.
The British Empire was made up of 400 million people, and its capital, London, was the richest city on the planet, with the biggest port in the world, importing food, steel, wool and timber. This film from 1904 shows 11 miles of wharfs, handling 60,000 ships a year. Tens of thousands worked in the docks and in the markets.
My great-grandfather was a driver, used to pick up chemicals from the docks onto a horse-driven cart and drive them back to a chemical factory in South London. That started his life in this very sphere. I think that's a pretty dangerous job, driving chemicals on the back of a cart through central London, yeah. Amazing I'm here. So the London docks, it's a real hub. It's built on physical labour, the physical transport of goods. And a lot of these men in the pictures, they would be casual workers, hired by the day. They'd have to turn up to the dock to see if there's work for them that day. The Edwardian period's a pretty tough time to be alive. OK, society's changing and reforms are being introduced, but people are working very long hours, average working week of 60 hours plus. Low wages on the whole for most people. So everybody you see here would have a story to tell, I'm sure, about their working lives.
Bobby Cooley works at the new Covent Garden Flower Market in Vauxhall. He was the third generation of porters to work in the old Covent Garden, then a fruit and veg market, not just flowers.
My dad's granddad works as a porter in Covent Garden, and my dad's dad. Me, lots of uncles at one time. I think I had 7 relatives working. I was 16 when I started. I was one of the last kiddies to be working hard in Covent Garden.
Little had changed in the way the market was run since Edwardian times.
Lots and lots of vegetables for sale, all sorts of stuff. Looks like spring, by the vegetables. Guys portering with the cotchels on their head and all sorts of things on their head. Bushels, which I know have 28 pound in them. Apples, looks like cabbages. You could sell a market porter. You normally had a scarf and a cap because you're carrying a lot of stuff on your nut and you don't want to sort of like completely do your brains in. Ladies, now this is an important part. Ladies here working hard in the market, the flower market as porters, and in the veg market shucking peas and processing stuff. I can really relate to these people in this picture here exactly because they're working as I used to work, i.e. they're working with wicker and boxes where we used to work with cardboard and plastic. But yeah, we shoved as much stuff around as they did. Covent Garden back in the 1900s, it was the larder of London. You had the Borough Market and Spitalfields, but Covent Garden was the big hub. Anything that was going anywhere was going to Covent Garden first. You can imagine it's quite a dangerous place to work. There's a lot of heavy goods being shifting around and horses moving. You know, them ladies up there were quite fearsome ladies. They used to, as much as the men, as far as the swearing goes, I was told. Having a hard life is a good life, because if you're working hard, you're getting paid. And all the guys in here, they're up early, whether we have a good trade or bad, they're here to do a day's work. And mostly, as it's eased off over the years, it's harder because there's less money to go around, but we're all after that money. It's lovely to see it in colour. I'm seeing flowers you can identify. Daffodils, hyacinths, daffodils, looks like irises. I'm seeing vegetables that look edible, rather than black and white. I might have spotted one of my granddads here, if I'm careful, back in the day, because we've been here since 1905, and that looks round about when it was.
London might have been the capital of the empire, but Britain's real wealth lay further north, where millions worked in the mills and the mines.
Long hours, accidents, deaths. It's a really dangerous industry.
You had to work so fast. You had to really go like that. You couldn't stop, and woe betide you if you missed any of the dirt.
Edwardian Britain was built on grindingly hard work. More than 10% of the population relied on coal for their livelihood. Never had more coal been dug. Britain's status as the most powerful nation in the world depended on coal. It was our biggest export. It powered our industry and heated our homes. Here, for the first time in colour, we see the life of a coal miner in Wigan in 1910.
Coal kept the nation going. The country would not have survived without it because it was so heavily reliant on industry. And with the new technology coming in, they needed it more than ever. So when we see these men, you know, the nation is on their shoulders.
We just can't imagine what it would be like to be a miner at that time. I mean, extremely tough conditions, extremes of temperature, both hot and cold, long hours, accidents, deaths. It's a really dangerous industry that was absolutely integral to everybody's everyday life and the industrial life of the country.
In Lancashire, its coal heritage is well remembered by the Chorley Empire film community.
My grandfather worked in the pit in Goulburn at this time, and in fact he was injured in a disaster. There was a fall of coal. Several people were killed, but he lost his leg and never worked again. And when you look at the conditions they were working under, it looks absolutely terrifying. So I look at them and I think one of them could be my grandfather, yes, which is extraordinary. It's very moving, it really is.
There were 350 collieries in Lancashire alone. Eric Lancaster worked as a miner on the Wigan coalface, where they mined using the same process as the Edwardians.
I started at New Colliery at 14 and a half. I worked in the stores till I could go down the mine. And then I went down the mine and was on what they call the haulage, where the rope used to pull the tubs along. And then I eventually got on the coalface. They're getting in the cage now to descend the mine. You went down at 7, because the pit whistle would go then. You could have 2 miles to get to the coalface. They had a man rider, loco, and that took you a mile. Then you walked a mile, then you got to the coalface, and then you started work. You'd keep on working till you cleared your coal. It was called a breadth. It was about the length of a terrace sitting room, about 12 feet, and about 4 foot thick and 4 foot advance. When you cleared it, you'd advance the face 4 foot. It was tough, and it was hot, and it was sweaty. So watching this film, it is realistic, because it was quite dirty. You got black. And when you'd finish your shift, you was covered in coal dust. So you wanted to get into the pithead baths for a real hot shower.
It wasn't just the men who worked in the coal industry. Women did too. Banned from working underground, thousands of girls and women worked on the surface, sorting coal and loading wagons. They were known as the pit brow lasses. Rita Culshaw is the 4th generation from her family who worked in the mines.
I left school when I was 15 and I started work on the Monday on the pit brow. And I went with my sister. Your hands got really cold and black and dirty. And you used to put Vaseline on your eyelids so that it was easy to wash the coal dust out. But after you'd had a bath, you were still picking bits of coal out of the corner of your eyes. Those pit brow girls, happy and smiling, like we all did, pushing the tubs. I remember they still dress like that, and they still folded their arms like that as well. aggressive, defensive, because they won't let the men pick on them. They're picking the dirt out of the coal, and you had to work so fast. You had to really go like that. You couldn't stop, and woe betide you if you missed any of the dirt. You weren't allowed to speak to each other. But one girl there named Edna Woodcock, she was a comic. She used to pick a spade up, and she used to get a spade. I'm leaning on a lamppost at the corner of the street. And she used to sing. They all used to sing, but they weren't allowed to speak. I think it was the atmosphere of being with such friendly girls. There was no arguing, backbiting or anything. It was just, but it was a job. I loved it. I loved it, and I loved the camaraderie of the girls. Oh, memories.
Besides coal, cotton was one of the biggest employers in Edwardian Britain. Britain's cotton industry reached its peak in 1912, when 8 billion yards of cloth were being produced, using raw materials from around the empire. With thousands of mills and weaving sheds across the county, Lancashire was the cotton capital of the world. And it wouldn't have been possible without the women who made up more than 60% of the workforce.
Chief employer of women at this time was the cotton industry. They were employed as weavers. A really good weaver could operate up to 8 looms. So they would work in a section of the factory, and they would just watch the looms, and if there was any snags or the shuttle needed to be refilled, they would get that ready. Very, very highly skilled work, weaving at this point. Deafening as well.
Actually, my mum worked in a mill. It was Farrington Mill. And as soon as the doors opened, it was deafening, was the sound of it. And my mum was partly deaf. Well, a lot of the ladies were. And they had to lip read each other, or they made hand singles to communicate with each other because of the amount of noise and dust.
Edwardian filmmakers couldn't easily film inside the mills, but this film shows the women workers leaving the Alfred Butterworth cotton factory near Manchester in 1901.
What's fascinating is the girls' hair's all covered, so women do not show long hair. So if you see the girls, the shawls are completely covering them, and you don't see their hair at all, you just see their faces. There's all this debate now about the hijab and about women covering their hair, and we forget that. We've lost that as part of our culture. That 100 years ago, you wouldn't walk out in the streets of Lancashire with your hair down.
In Edwardian Britain, men's roles have been publicly documented, but women's work could be every bit as skilled, as captured in this rare footage from 1910 of the Siemens Brothers factory in Dalston, East London, where women are busy making electric lamps.
Watching the work that she's doing, it's skilled work. You know, it is really intricate, detailed work, difficult work as well, which would have taken a lot of concentration, a lot of effort. And we think about the working hours as well, how long you would sit and do that for. And the colours of it, again, you know, we often think of the working classes very drab in old clothes, in black and white, and you see the different patterns, the different textures, and it makes them real. It shows what they did have, that these aren't people to pity, that they led these lives of colour and of richness as well in one way. And I love that she's wearing her locket and her jewellery as well. You know, it challenges a lot of people's perceptions of what the working class would have looked like in Edwardian Britain. This is a working woman. She isn't something out of a Dickens novel. She's real, she's got her jewellery, she's neat, she's tidy.
The quality of the film, the exactitude of the images, it's really extraordinary. We're used to everybody being a bit distant, but these images of ordinary people working, they're very touching, really. They're very moving because you feel a kind of human connection with somebody who's just, there doing something. And there's nothing more human than working with your hands, really. And to have these very very beautiful and very clear images of people doing intricate work for you to watch. You can't help but look at her hair, and her hair's been done very nicely for the film, but it seems to be moved by a gust of wind. It's a small thing which goes beyond what's in the image and reminds you that you're looking at a real person, a real incident. Those are the things that connect us to the past.
It's just lovely to see life as it was being lived, you know, see people at work. It's the mundaneness, the humanity of it somehow. Concentration. They used to talk about women and the low-paid work, you know, the invisible work, the 5 Cs. So women as cleaning, cooking, cashiering, clerking, and caring. There were also women in factories, as we've seen here, but it's the lowest paid work, often the slightly dangerous work. But having said that, the options for men as well were much more defined and confined for particular classes of people than they are now.
In Edwardian Britain, all classes of people had to wear hats. You weren't fully dressed if you didn't wear one, and the hat defined your position in society, from top hats and boaters to bowlers and flat caps. Stockport was the world centre for hat making in 1910. Here it's the men who are hard at work making the popular fur felt hat. Steve Cossey is perhaps the last apprentice from Stockport still working in the hat industry.
The processes that they go through are over 130 processes, just from that to actually get it blocked into a shape. The blocking aspect is done with the boiling water. So the hats are put into the boiling water, which means the hat body then is pliable, so they're able to stretch the hat body over the wooden blocks. Sometimes the air gets trapped between the hat body and the block, so they're used to blowing it to get all the air out. The men could block around probably 200 to 300 hats a day. You can imagine the problem they have with their hands, putting it in and out of the boiling water.
But it wasn't just their hands which suffered.
I'm a hatter, and many people would know the term from Alice in Wonderland, the Mad Hatter. Now, the Mad Hatter comes from when they used to use mercury to make the hats, and it made all the men who made the hats go nutty, basically. And this wasn't realised until quite late after they'd been using it, and then once that was found, then they abolished it and was never to be used again. It was very hard, very hard. You know, it's quite a lot of pressure on the hand, and it's the vibration and the fur rubbing on your hands which can cause the sores. What we want to do is keep this tradition going, so the hat industry is still alive, but we want to keep using the traditional methods and make them in the UK, in Stockport or Denton, just like they did in the early 1900s.
If life over 100 years ago was very different, the biggest difference was in the lives that children were forced to lead in Edwardian Britain.
It would have been hard work, heavy, dirty, hard work, and children were useful because they could get between the looms.
We talk about social mobility these days. These kids wouldn't have had an opportunity to stay on at school very long, and going to university would be like going to a different planet.
Edwardian Britain was the richest, most powerful nation in the world. Its power and wealth was built on the hard work of men, women, and children. All children had a basic education, but most left school by 12. The factories and mills depended on child workers, and families needed the income. Across the nation, even the smallest of children would try and find work doing something. Former politician Alan Johnson grew up in poverty in post-war London, in conditions similar to many of the children featured here in the early 1900s.
I love this. So I used to drink water out of those fountains, where there was a fountain for the horse and then drinking water on the end. So all around North Kensington, there was, including the corner of my street and Southam Street, there was a horse trough. And the toddlers would come and tie their horse up at lunchtime, usually pop in the Earl of Warwick for a pint. And they'd put a nose bag over the horse's ears for the food and then take them to the trough for the water. And those kids look as if they're up to no good. 3 ragamuffins.
Difficult to know what they are. They could be rag pickers, people who make an existence by just harvesting discarded clothes and recycling them in some way. It certainly doesn't look like a toy cart. It looks like they're at work, probably on the embankment.
Some children worked as half-timers, school until noon, then to work, like these seen here at the Butterworth Cotton Factory near Manchester.
So this is the reason why Lancashire was such a prosperous county in the Edwardian and the Victorian age, because women worked, the men worked, and the children worked. So they would have 3 or 4 income for a household, and the factories, they would employ up to 6,000 to 8,000 people, some of these factories. It would have been hard work, heavy, dirty, hard work, and children were useful because they could get between the looms.
The way we now see children is very different from the way in which Edwardian society saw children. For working families, they saw children as a source of labour, extra labour, especially labour that men didn't want to do, that women couldn't perhaps do, and that they could. But there was a call for reform and for children to attend schools. And certainly laws came in to try and force all children to attend school, but many didn't. Many still worked, and many of the families relied on the labour that children provided.
This was the first age of filmmaking, so it was still unusual to see a film camera outside your factory gate. The children are intrigued.
It's almost like he's going, look at me, and he looks, and he's playing in front, and he hits his friend. But he's so natural in front of the camera. He's like the instant film star. He does look like the Artful Dodger. You've really brought him to life.
In their faces, there's a lot in there. They look old beyond their years, and it's partly the clothes, it's partly that they're at work, it's partly, you know, some of those faces are pinched with poverty, and they would have seen a lot in their short lives, I'm sure.
All the missed opportunities. I mean, we talk about social mobility these days. These kids wouldn't have had an opportunity to, certainly not to stay on at school very long, and going to university would be like going to a different planet. So they knew where they were going, into the factory. There's a bloke with bow legs coming down there. That's rickets. Can hardly walk. Oh, painful.
Children were at risk of rickets whilst they were still growing. It's caused by malnutrition, lack of vitamin D and lack of sunlight.
Well, it was beginning to die out, but it was still a fairly common feature. So living conditions are improving, infant health is beginning to improve, all these things that contribute to those kinds of changes. But as you can see, it's still very present in some of these films.
Kind of gets me is that some of these lads probably didn't come back from the war. You start to project our knowledge of what would happen in the build-up. You think these lads who are staring at the camera and, you know, look so innocent. This generation, this decade of time would change their lives forever. So that, it feels like quite poignant when you do see them coming out.
That's what I find fascinating about these films. Picking out an individual and wondering exactly what became of them and where their children are today or their grandchildren.
This was a new century with a new king and new thinking. For the British people, this meant while they worked hard, they got to play too.
What we're seeing here is children from Altrincham really excited, about to board a train to Moberly, which is only 7 miles away. And it's their big day out. For these kids, they get to see acrobats, bizarre puppeteers. It may seem a little bit underpowered for the kids of today, but at that time, for these children, this is a really special, really liberating experience.
It was a hard time, the Edwardian period, for children because their parents often were working full time. They didn't have a lot of opportunity to get outdoors. So this is one of the reasons why outings like this were so important, to try and get children out into the countryside, away from the sort of polluted areas in towns and into the fresh air, so they could run around and play. And I mean, childhood was very short at this point. You know, people had to grow up very quickly and get to work, and you really, I mean, we have a concept of childhood, you know, really lasting now until sort of 18, but childhood in many ways was over by the time you were 12 in the Edwardian period.
But men, women and children were united in their pride for their king, country and community. They came together for huge celebrations like this one in 1902, the once every 20 years Preston Guild, opened by the Mayor Frederick Arthur Stanley, the 16th Earl of Derby. The week-long processions date back to medieval times, but now a new world is being celebrated, and new inventions.
So it's not unlike a modern carnival, different floats coming through the town, and they're all part of the textile trade, and of course that's the thing that had made this region, you know, had made the area what it was. And that is the symbol of the trade. I mean, you know, the loom. That would have meant so much to so many people. Generations of people's families would have worked in different elements around those kinds of machines, you know, from the kids sweeping up on the floor to the supervisors running a whole floor of hundreds of these things. It would have been a huge occasion for the town. You see the pavements thronged, especially if it's only happening every 20 years or so. What's that pig doing? I'm surprised to see a pig in the middle of a textile parade.
Wow, the famous Myerscough pig. So Myerscough were butchers based in Preston on Shepherd Street, and they had a factory, but in the 19th century they became famous for their sausages, which were called MP sausages. The pig became a sort of mascot for them. It went on to appear in 2 more guilds in 1922 and in 1952, so it became a bit of a star. Sadly, we don't know what happened to it. I mean, look at the guys. I mean, they've got butchers with huge knives as well. I've never, it's crazy. I think because you've got colourised, things stand out that you wouldn't have seen before. It's a fantastic piece of footage.
Leisure time, previously just for the rich, was now available to the working class, even if it was just 1 day a week. Seasonal fun parks were very popular in the early 1900s, like this one near Halifax in Yorkshire.
This is Sunnyvale Hipper Home Pleasure Gardens. It was 2 shillings to get in, and it was a place where the emerging middle class and also the aspirational working class would go for their leisure time. So you'd have boating lakes, you'd have swings and people dancing. So it was just you dressed up, it was your Sunday best. You put your best shoes on, you didn't wear your clogs, you wore everything. This is actually an early form of a roller coaster. It's called a mountain glider or a switchback. We were taken up the hill by a horse, and you can see the horse in the shot, and then you just were let down on this, almost like a carriage that you would see in coal mines, and you're on this little rickety carriage, and then it would break at the bottom.
The man operating the mountain glider is Joseph Bunce, owner of Sunnyvale Gardens, who paid for the filming as an early tourist film. One of the other activities filmed was donkey riding, a seemingly hazardous pursuit for the ladies.
Ooh, ouch. That looks very painful. Humiliation on film has never ceased to be everybody's favourite thing, you know. Also, I thought perhaps maybe she's drunk.
They do look as if they're having a wonderful time. The lady who fell off the donkey laughs and gets straight back on. I mean, you know, good for her. Yeah. They're obviously having a great time.
Filmmakers would often introduce comic interludes to their films to keep cinema audiences entertained. If you look closer at the lady, you can see that her hair is cut short. Perhaps this is an early example of a stuntman caught on film. With the northern mill workers allowed 1 full week off a year, that created a whole new sector, the world's first seaside holiday resorts for working and middle classes alike, and one towered above them all.
Blackpool had a unique offer. Nowhere else had 3 piers, nowhere else had a Blackpool Tower. It was the place to be.
Britain in the Edwardian era was the richest, most powerful nation in the world. All this was thanks to the enormous hard work by its people. Finally, leisure too was part of their lives. For the mill workers of the north, they could now enjoy 1 week's unpaid holiday a year. And for millions of people in the early 1900s, that meant the seaside. And the ultimate place for Edwardian entertainment, Blackpool.
This is Blackpool Victoria Pier, and this is a really fascinating film because this is the 3rd pier that was built in Blackpool. So Blackpool has 3 piers. It has the North Pier, the Central Pier, and this was called the Victoria Pier. And it was opened in 1893. Now it's called the South Pier.
The 3 piers were all connected by the promenade and the trams running along Blackpool's central seafront.
This film was made commemorating the opening of the new promenade in 1904, which allowed, this fantastic promenade walkway right up to the new pier, Victoria Pier.
And what they're doing is promenading, really what piers were built for. You promenaded on the pier.
It's the idea of you being able to walk out to sea and being able to look back at Blackpool. I mean, that was a huge attraction. I mean, promenading was a big social activity at this point. Wonderful glimpse back at the sands there of the early housing in Blackpool. Most of that is now gone. You know, it's been replaced by large hotels. This tram is also incredible because it's also advertising Blackpool's famous winter gardens, a fantastic indoor entertainment complex with the Opera House and then the Empress Ballroom. So a real palace of entertainment, one of the big attractions in Blackpool where everybody went to enjoy the greatest stars of the day or dance on the fantastic Empress Ballroom dance floor. You've got middle-class people and working-class people all mingling together in ballrooms. Everybody knew how to dance, everybody could waltz, and it was a big part of the culture of this time.
You dressed up to go to the seaside in the way that you dressed up to go out on a Saturday night. You only had that week off, and you didn't get paid for it, and you saved your money, or you'd have holiday clubs.
They came here for access to the sea, to bathe. They came here for the sweets, the treats, the ice cream. You know, they came for things that they couldn't really get at home.
At the same time as the Victoria Pier, the great Blackpool institution of the Pleasure Beach was opening and developing it. They brought these incredible rides from all over the world, and the river caves was this incredible journey. So you went through all the caves of the world in Blackpool. So it was an astonishing attraction.
The River Caves attraction is still running here today. The other ride going strong is the Captive Flying Machines by Sir Hiram Maxim, the oldest ride on the Pleasure Beach, thrilling the public since 1904. Maxim is best known for designing the first automatic machine gun, but he dreamt of inventing powered flight. By designing this amusement ride, he hoped to raise funds to build a working aircraft. Sadly, this was the nearest to the flying machine he achieved in his lifetime. The Wright brothers got there first. With 4 million visitors a year, Blackpool became a magnet for a new wave of entrepreneurs. The illuminations we enjoy today first lit up the town in 1912, and nowhere else had the ultimate money-making attraction, Blackpool Tower.
It was built on the most prominent position overlooking the central beach, which was where Blackpool sprung from. It was where all the entertainment was first offered to the masses who arrived on their day trips and then holidays.
Blackpool Tower was always about making money, and it made a lot of money. It could have thousands of people could go through its door every day for a mixture of attractions. So you could go dancing, you could have a cup of tea. It was almost like a multi-purpose venue that we think of nowadays before they were built. There's nothing wasted in this building. Every single bit of this building is economically viable.
Even the legs of Blackpool Tower were used to house a circus, designed by Frank Matcham.
Blackpool Tower Circus is the oldest continuous circus in the world because it's never broke season. 3,000 people would come here for 3 shows a day. So it was advertised as a variety and aquatic circus. So basically, this ring would drop down and 40,000 gallons of water would come in, and then people would swim, horses would dive into it. The central stars were the clowns. Blackpool Tower clowns were very famous. At the early period, there was definitely elephants, and in the morning, during the season, they would take them down and you'd go out onto the promenade and they would actually go swimming in the water, in the sea. And it was a very clever attraction because basically people would come to see the elephants going in the sea, but it was also a way of advertising the circus. Blackpool was very much a place of showing and enjoying. Obviously, after the death of Queen Victoria, people could actually just feel more relieved, and Edward was a fantastic king in that way. He was a very jolly king, but those 9 years of his reign are particularly poignant because so much social change, but so much joy as well.
This is a form of time travel. These are lives being lived out in front of your eyes to act as our witness, really, to the past. And I think they're wonderful.
Seeing these films with their full colour again, when you get a sense of the life in a way which is much more direct and much more kind of immediate and affecting.
I think what some of these images show you is the individual behind the wider story. And in the individual, you have those who enjoy their life. I mean, they have limited opportunities and aspirations, but they're still having fun one day and there's an awful story the next. And I think the images take you to that level of the individual's experiences. And I think there's something really powerful and beautiful about that, actually, because too often in history you put people into boxes and then the box has a narrative around how hard life was. And yes, it was hard, but there was so much more going on.
Next time, Edwardian Britain locked in a power struggle. Workers unite and fight for fairer work and pay. Women demand a voice, the vote, and a place in the world. Victories are won, but a whole generation would make the ultimate sacrifice. All this is captured on Edwardian Britain in colour. The Edwardian era, from 1901 to 1914, was a period of rapid change and excitement. Miraculous new feats of British engineering were changing the world. The unsinkable Titanic, built here in Belfast and set sail in Southampton in 1912, and the motor car boasting a top speed of 12 miles per hour, were inventions that revolutionised life for all kinds of people.
The Edwardian period was the start of a new decade, of a new century. People were prosperous, people were happier. They were kind of coming out of that long mourning period for Queen Victoria. There's a whole feeling of optimism.
Cities and towns across the north, like Wigan, captured here in 1902, were being transformed by modern forms of transport.
This is the opening of the trams. So the trams were an absolutely important thing for linking small industrial towns together. So when a new tram opened, everybody would come out and celebrate.
Virtually every major town in Lancashire had a tramway by certainly the early 1900s. Previously, they would have had horse-drawn trams, and so this was like state-of-the-art, new technology, and they were very much part of civic pride.
In 1900, more than 1 million horses were required to pull Britain's trams and buses, but just a decade later, they had all but vanished. British-engineered double-decker trams like these were a proud emblem of progress.
The excitement, the joy on people's faces at seeing this new innovation. At this time, everything was innovative, everything was changing. Not just for upper classes, not just for middle classes, but for working everyday people. I think there's something really special about that.
And I love that we've got the old and the new side by side. Coachman in the red coat coming alongside the newer tram that's going to displace him, just getting ready to start. We're leaving behind that world of horse-drawn carriages and horse-drawn carts, and we're moving into a different kind of time.
I absolutely love this shot of the little girl being picked up by her dad, so she's on camera. Everyone around her is cheering and excited. It's just a moment of absolute joy. It's fantastic. And even the couple in the very middle-class couple in the background, a guy's waving his riding crop, I think. Everyone wants to be part of this moment. They see it as a historic moment.
This film was shot by Mitchell and Kenyon, two Edwardian entrepreneurs who travelled the country documenting everyday life. And on this occasion, they couldn't resist an attempt at comedy.
But look at this. The filmmakers obviously set up a comedic element. You can see the guy in the bowler hat is clearly setting it up and sort of directing it there, and he's giving the sort of saying to and he's like pushing the man directly into the hosepipe, which is hilarious.
These had a locality of maybe 10 or 12 miles. They were not really shown anywhere else outside the area. It's actuality, it's entertainment to show people a bit of their hometown on film and get yourself on the screen.
And the colour just really brings this scene to life. It closes that gap down between us as viewers and them as subjects in the film. It makes them seem much more like us.
It's like time travelling. It's like you're going back and walking amongst these people who are exactly like us and lead such similar lives to the ones we lead today.
The Edwardian period is the most fascinating period of the last 100 years because it's a period of rapid transformation where people's standards of living increases quite quickly, their access to leisure time and holidays, and new technology is starting to make a massive difference to their lives.
With more time for leisure, sport became part of daily life. Cricket and tennis had long been favoured by the wealthy, but now the working man had football. Where 2,000 or 3,000 would watch in the Victorian era, now matches were attracting crowds of more than 30,000. This FA Cup third-round match between Burnley and Spurs at Turf Moor shows there was nothing bigger than supporting your local team.
Quite extraordinary. You can't hear the supporters. However, 23,000 Burnley supporters wouldn't have been quiet that day. I've been following Burnley since 1972. I came down, my dad brought me on a Fulham game in 1972 down at Burnley. I've followed them for 20 years without missing a game home and away. Looking at the footage, Burnley shown in green and white, that is the correct colours of the day. It wasn't up to this start in the 1910 season that we changed to claret and blue. The captain that day was a gentleman called Alex Leake. He led the Burnley players out. And it was a big, big occasion. Cup fever in an olden day. All the guys in the background, they're wearing flat caps. It looks like they've come straight from the mills. To the mill workers and the mine workers in the area, this is what they live for, football. This is where their outlet from coming out of the mines, out of the mills, they come straight down here and to watch Burnley play.
The average ticket cost only £1 in today's money, and apparently the beer was just as cheap.
rather the worse for wear before the football match. I mean, football's huge for many communities, supporting your local town. It's become a regular kind of leisure pursuit for many men.
We know that then these films were shown in the local exhibition places, that people responded to seeing their players, and if the home team lost, they didn't show the film.
Luckily, Burnley won the game 3-1, so the footage survives. Edwardians were proud, not only of their football team, but of their local community, and they loved to show it. Big social events like this charity swimming gala in Tynemouth in 1901 were an opportunity for the whole town to come out and enjoy themselves.
The Edwardians loved to put on a show for local people. They loved civic events and galas and, as I say, processions. So this is very appropriate for Tynemouth, to put on a gala, have people swimming, have people diving, you know, and lots of people in boats watching, because it's a town that's fiercely proud of its maritime history.
This is the fancy dress swimming parade in Tynemouth. So they start with top hats, and then they have to wear almost like this gentleman's costumes, and then they swim. And it's a local annual charity competition. It's so funny, seeing men dressed up in fancy dress swimming. It's kind of like the ludicrous pantomime of Edwardian entertainment.
I mean, most of the people watching would not be able to swim, so this is incredibly daring, foolhardy activity. And they're not in the safety of the local swimming pool, they're actually in the Tyne. It looks absolutely freezing.
This reminds me of growing up in the northeast and going to Tynemouth open air pool, which was a tidal pool filled with seawater. So I remember just how cold it was, and they're a lot hardier, the Edwardians, than we are. I think we're all a bit soft now.
But Edwardian Britain wasn't all fun and games. Workers took to the streets to demand a fair deal, as a wave of strikes threatened to pull the nation apart.
Working class people seem to push for a better deal after centuries of having a pretty rubbish deal. And this is the first time you really see this, and it's played out on the streets.
The Edwardian policeman is a figure we can recognise today. Throughout the era, the profession modernised as officers were issued standard uniforms and equipment, and even began using methods like fingerprint analysis.
A policeman had to be a certain height in the Edwardian period, so most policemen that you see command attention from their height, and there's that kind of demeanour of authority.
These men are the new recruits of what is now known as the Greater Manchester Police.
I love this scene because it looks to me, this is their equipment, and I think there's a truncheon, certainly a truncheon. That's what they defend themselves with. Their notebook, I think we're seeing there, a whistle, and a pair of handcuffs. The four essential things that you would find on a police officer today.
Only 1 in 5 applicants were successful. The perfect candidate was over 5'7", physically fit, and had a stable personal life. Criteria that haven't changed too much over the years.
We certainly did that as well. They tended to select people who were under 30, and if they were married, they were told they couldn't have more than 2 children when they joined. And if you wanted to get married, you had to ask permission to get married. I remember when I got married in 1981, I had to put in a form in asking permission to get married. So it still carried on then. I was sent away with other male colleagues to an army training centre. It was such a shock to the system. I can remember phoning my dad and saying, what on earth have I got myself into?
Policing's pretty varied at this time. See here, they're involved in first aid, they're involved in ambulance work.
I like this bit, by the way. The very latest methods of ambulance work. They just roll up, stick out of stretcher. Put this poor guy on the stretcher, who probably shouldn't be moved, stick him in the back, and that's the very latest methods of policing. It's amazing.
Keen to publicise their achievements, the police force themselves commissioned this 30-minute-long documentary. It's perhaps an early example of Edwardian corporate PR.
There's an interesting thing already that the makers of this film have seen it as necessary to say our friends, the police, almost as if they're trying to convince the audience who may be watching this that the police are their friends. It's almost as if they're producing this to try and tell the audience what the police do, because people don't know what they do, or they want to change the perception of what people think the police do.
It shows that the people that have been recruited in civilian clothes, they're ordinary people. I think they're trying to instill that sense of you can trust us because we are you.
One January morning in 1911, in the shadowy streets of London's East End, the police were about to face something no training could have prepared them for. One of the most infamous gun battles in British history, all remarkably caught on film.
Oh, it's just amazing, isn't it? The siege of Sydney Street. Something we can relate to today because it's a terrorist incident.
A gang of Latvian anarchists were on the run after murdering 3 policemen in a failed jewellery robbery.
2 of them got trapped in this house in Sydney Street. Amazing piece of intelligence to track them down. So they were the guns that the police had, totally inadequate. But the unusual thing is that the army were called in. I think the first and only time that the police have called the army in to assist them, because they had nothing to match the firepower of these 2 Latvians who were cornered in this house in Sydney Street.
The East End was home to a large working class and immigrant population. It was seen as a hotbed of political activism, and those in power were determined to stamp out any signs of social unrest.
Early 20th century Britain, the fear of anarchism was very strong, and there was a fear that anarchists would take over the country or cause so much disarray that there would be social revolution. So in many ways, the Sydney Street siege shows that we do need army, we do need a police force, that there is a need for law and order. It provides a justification for it.
The siege lasted for over 6 hours. And standing less than 100 yards from the gunfire, a familiar figure came down to get involved.
Oh, and there's Winston Churchill there in the top hat, who had come down to, some say, to direct operations, and people weren't sure about his authority to do that, although he obviously had a military background himself.
So Churchill's there as Home Secretary, looking as if he's in charge. Well, of course, he shouldn't be in charge. The whole point of our system was we set up the police, they would be citizens in uniform and not directed by politicians. So Churchill had no role there. The very presence of a politician might well have been putting the police in more danger because they would have to protect him. He went there just because he couldn't resist the temptation of being in the lead. I mean, he was a bit of a showman, was our Winnie.
At this time, Winston Churchill was a very ambitious young politician, and his attempt to resolve the Sydney Street siege was an attempt to place his name and his picture on the front pages as some sort of saviour.
Now here, a fire started in the house where the 2 Latvians were holding out under siege. Nobody knows how that fire started, but Churchill had said, no, let the fire burn. Either the Latvians will come out or they'll die. The guy being carried out is a fireman. 1 fireman was killed, actually, in this. It was a big incident. I remember when I was a kid, it was still a big thing. You can read lots of articles and books about it, but actually watching, seeing it, seeing Churchill turn up, seeing it happening, it's fascinating.
Tension and conflict were in the air, and it now exploded in a wave of workers' strikes, the likes of which Britain had never seen before. In 1913 alone, there were 1,500 strikes. From dockers here in Liverpool to miners, teachers and bus drivers. All took to the streets to fight against the old order. In Dublin, 20,000 transport workers, most forced to work 17-hour days, were locked in industrial disputes without wages for 6 long months.
Working class people seem to be rising up in all sorts of ways. They're organising politically, they're forming political parties. Those of them who have the vote are beginning to use it, and they're beginning to use it to push for a better deal after centuries of having a pretty rubbish deal. And this is the first time you really see this, and it's played out on the streets.
But it's a much smaller strike, a group of hotel workers in Dublin, that provides a rare glimpse into life on the Edwardian picket line.
So this looks like the price list in the strike committee's cafe. You can't strike on an empty stomach.
Wow, you pay high prices, but we're paid loads of wages. This shows how, in the Edwardian period, people were becoming more aware of what they were getting paid in relative to what they were selling, so that somebody was making a profit out of their low wages. So they're starting to create these banners. I mean, that's absolutely fascinating.
I love this sign. If we are soup service, we are not dished yet. Not quite sure he's got that right, but he's very proud of that. He's done that himself. And he's standing there with that very forbidding knife. It looks like he's parted his hair with that knife, by the way, down the middle of his head.
At this time, 9 out of 10 people owned, in effect, nothing at all. These workers were demanding only basic improvements, an extra penny on their hourly wage, some kind of state pension, and as we are seeing here, a reduction on a 14-hour working day.
These women would have been taking a particular risk. It was entirely legal to sack striking workers, all of them, on day one of the strike. But they look as if they're on their way to a victory. They're certainly very cheerful.
The fact that they're laughing and smiling about it is amazing. It sort of shows, in a way, their confidence in what they're doing. You know, they believe they're right. We're seeing that moment of fight when you're driven by what you think is right. They're not looking sad, they're not looking down. These people are laughing. They know what they're doing. They're confident in what they're doing, and they're happy that they're doing it.
Protest and confrontation was now contagious. This footage of mass unionist demonstrations in Belfast shows how arguments over Home Rule threatened to spark civil war in the United Kingdom.
This clip is absolutely fascinating. It's showing a huge affiliation to the rest of Britain.
It reminds me strongly of some of the Orange Order marches that we used to see every summer when I was growing up in Liverpool. And we can see they've sent a contingent, it would seem, over to support these marches in Belfast. The fashions haven't changed much either. They still wear bowler hats for that.
The idea of Home Rule was something so unknown. It was a bit like sort of political climates today, when we don't know what's going to happen when there will be huge changes to our borders and to our country. And it was this potential that it might have, the potential for violence, the potential to split families, the potential to cause damage that would be irreversible.
But more than Irish Home Rule or workers' strikes, it was a group of middle-class women and their demands for change that was to shake Edwardian Britain to its very core.
You see the moment of a sacrifice. You see the moment where somebody puts their cause beyond their own safety.
Across Edwardian Britain, ordinary people were fighting for a better deal. And the suffragettes were leading the charge for women, as large public marches like this one in London in 1910 became increasingly common.
Oh, wow. Fortune favours the brave. Women of all backgrounds with, again, their amazing hats, marching in military style, but yet this is a feminine march, all the flowing robes. My great-grandmother, Emmeline Pankhurst, was the leader of the suffragette movement. Her photo is used as the iconic symbol of power and demand and uncompromising leadership. It's a role that she can play and that she will play, and she won't give up. She will campaign to the end.
Oh my goodness. So this is incredible to watch this clip, because the banner that is being marched forward now was made to commemorate the founding of the WSPU, the Women's Social and Political Union, in 1903.
That's incredible. Famed for deeds of daring rectitude. Wow, champion of womanhood. I mean, that just makes me so proud. It was much broader than just votes for women. It was about really changing attitudes towards women, and they were at the forefront of that.
The colorisation process is fabulous in that it brings it to life. When you have the black and white, the white is lost because it's just black or white. Here, when you've got the different colours, the white actually emerges as very powerful. It is one of the symbolically important colours for the suffragettes. White for purity. If we go back in time, the reality of life is one where women's options are totally constrained. If you had children, they are the property of your husband, and you're not a citizen. You're not allowed to vote. You're not seen to have a say beyond the home.
Before the Pankhursts, the fight for women's suffrage was a relatively tame one. The National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies persevered with peaceful and polite protests like this one. But Pankhurst suffragettes took a radically different approach.
The women's suffrage movement started, well before 1903, and you had 50 years of campaigning before then, and thousands of petitions that were not getting anywhere. And with the beginnings of the suffragette movement, you have more voice, more noise, more engagement. It becomes the issue that so many people are talking about.
The suffragettes very famously adopted the phrase deeds, not words, and they lived by that. They adopted more and more violent tactics as the years went on.
Window smashing, letterbox bombing, hunger strikes. The police clashed with the suffragettes on a fairly regular basis, and that image of women fighting for the vote against a state represented by the police that was denying them that vote is a really powerful image. They felt they had to do this in order to push for that vote, which just had been denied them by this time for more than 50 years.
We're seeing them respond to this idea that deeds will get attention. Even if it's bad press, it will get you press, it will get you heard, it will get the messages of votes for women in the newspapers.
There's a lot of suffrage film, and the suffragettes were very good at recording what they were doing. They were making a conscious effort to make their mark and also to create films that they could then show in local settings. So they were extremely good at marketing their message. Colours, the purple, white and green.
And we can see in the march they're carrying their prison arrows on poles. The prison arrow represented that you were the property of the government. And it's amazing to see that they reclaim that. So they take on marches to show we are the property of a government that won't give us a voice, that won't give us a vote, that imprisons us and that arrests us.
Such bravery. I mean, the way that these women were force-fed, they went on hunger strikes and they knew the terrible pain and suffering that went on. And then they'd leave prison and then do it, the same thing all over again and go on hunger strike again. But you can understand it, can't you? It just seems, I talk to my daughters now, how could so relatively recently anyone argue that women shouldn't have a vote?
One woman above all is remembered today for her commitment to the cause, Emily Wilding Davison. Seen here in her academic robes, she obtained a first-class degree from Oxford, but was never permitted to graduate because she was a woman.
Emily was almost wildly committed to the cause. She was one of the first people to be force-fed. We know she broke into Parliament several times. And I think at this stage, the fight for women's suffrage, the fight for the vote, had almost reached its point.
The 1913 Epsom Derby, the scene of the most shocking 5 seconds of film footage of the Edwardian era.
So this is an incredible moment in British history.
Big sporting occasion, well-known event.
You see people in their best hats and their best outfits.
People turn out in their thousands to go and watch it, but of course this one, we know, ends rather differently. It's known for being more than a horse race.
This is on tape. This is us seeing that moment 100+ years later. You see the people physically going back as they see the horses come past, and the speed at which all of that's happening.
And somewhere in that crowd, we know there's Emily Davison.
Huge crowds, here she comes.
Sorry.
And there she is. Oh.
It's shocking, it's still shocking to see her suddenly run out.
I genuinely, when I'm watching this moment where she sort of steps out, I want to cover my eyes.
It's almost amazing that she's still standing then. So many horses have gone past her. Oh. And it's so fleeting almost, you could miss it. I mean, just the incredible kind of bravery of that stands out, and that moment of contact and impact is just awful to watch.
It's the act you see the moment of a sacrifice, you see the moment where somebody puts their cause beyond their own safety.
Miraculously, Emily Davison survived for 4 days. It's thought she was trying to attach a scarf to the King's horse in protest.
She knows it will make news, she knows it will make headlines, she wants to make headlines for the women's cause. I don't think she wants or expects to die. So people call her a martyr. I'd say she is a martyr, not necessarily an intentional one.
This moment is synonymous with the word suffragette. You can't talk about them without talking about the suffragette who threw herself in front of the King's horse. What makes me so angry as well is that for a long time, and in all the newspapers, people were more concerned about the horse than they were about the woman. And I just think that is a testament to how women were treated at the time, how women's rights were considered at the time.
It's just such a kind of metaphor for, here's one woman just trying to stand against this tide, and in a sense it's a representative of that tide of opposition to suffrage, and someone who's standing there just saying, enough.
At Emily Davison's funeral, 5,000 suffragettes marched behind her coffin, determined to make her a martyr for the cause. And a further 50,000 supporters lined the streets of London.
There's no doubt about the emotions on people's faces. I fought the good fight. The women saluting with their black bands.
Oh, those girls watching at the top. There's a huge crowd attending this funeral of the martyr for the suffrage cause. So the organisation, WSPU, but ordinary people too, were determined that she would not die in vain. It really is a moment created by women for women.
The suffragettes were incredibly good at the planning of events and the visual side of things, so they were given very specific instructions about what to wear and what flowers to bring and how to present themselves. Knowing that the visual image of all of this was part of the propaganda.
It's like a state funeral. It's sending off one of their own, and I think it shows the element of how they saw themselves as an army, how they saw themselves as soldiers, because it quite has that very militant aspect to it. It must have been really hard for these women who were, burying a friend, burying a comrade, to have to put on a show and to use it actually as another moment to push forward the cause.
And you see in the first few days, the media is very critical of Emily Wilding Davison's act. That changes quite quickly. By the end of the week, there's a lot more sympathy and understanding and appreciation, I think, for her and for the cause.
I think women in those times involved in this struggle were incredibly brave, and, we owe them a great, great debt.
This was not just about the vote. It was never just about the vote. It wasn't about a legal or structural or policy change. It was about changing social norms. It was about changing society's views about what women could dream to be and do. And it was about individual women doing more with their lives, doing different things with their lives, counting themselves in a way that society didn't count them. So from that perspective, well beyond the vote, it's those things that people admire and appreciate them for.
In their fight for equality, these Edwardian women knew their enemy. But British men would now face a new threat, and it was on a scale that few could have ever imagined.
They were told, we have more men, more arms than the Germans. This is just a matter of finishing them off, and you'll all be back by Christmas. And we all know what happened next.
In July 1914, people enjoyed a long, hot summer, largely unaware that war was looming over Edwardian Britain.
Well, this is incredibly poignant footage because it's taken just a few weeks before the outbreak of the First World War, and that war is going to change everything, and it's going to bring the Edwardian era to a close, and social life is not quite the same again after it.
It's sad to see all these boys. Actually, many of them were about the right age to have been either conscripted, near the end of the First World War, or volunteered. When you see them crawling along doing that stuff there, they're almost like they're crawling under barbed wire or going through hoops, the kind of stuff they would do in their army training and then eventually out on the battlefield. And to see them at play, sun shining, grass green, whole lives in front of them.
Just looking at this crowd of people, things were sort of building up, tensions were rising, but that didn't impact their, life didn't stop. And it's just amazing to think that, within 2 weeks, a lot of these men would have been gone, or would have been quite excited to sign up.
On the 4th of August 1914, Britain declared war with Germany. 3,000 men a day signed up to fight. Whole towns enlisted together, like these volunteers from Morecambe.
This film is particularly poignant for me because this is my hometown, and that's the Morecambe Winter Gardens. It's all within that same area. You could actually go that area today and it's still exactly the same. All those buildings are still there. The regiments going from Lancaster, one of the greatest fatalities was the Lancashire regiments. My own great-grandfather was in these regiments and went off to war and came back severely disabled and could have been one of these. This is an emotional film for me. I don't really look at it as historical. I look at it as my own friends and family were going off to war.
So these are the professionals, but of course supplemented by Your Country Needs You volunteers. This won't take long, chaps. Regular soldiers, maybe, and they would have been bemused by trench warfare.
You'd have to have a heart of stone to watch any footage of men marching for World War I and not feel the tragedy of it. They're so young. These are men who, you know, if they were too young, were kind of sent out to have a birthday and come back in again.
You can tell it's very early on in the war. You can tell because there's this mass optimism that they think the war's only going to be like 5 months, or I'm going to be home for Christmas, is one of those tragic postcards you often read about. Everything about this is very poignant.
And these young boys, like, waving their flags, they're showing their patriotism, they're carrying one of the soldiers' kit bags. They want to join in, they want to kind of be like the older boys, the older men who are marching. And you think, in a way, these younger boys are probably the lucky ones because they escaped that. They escaped what would have been an almost certain death.
These soldiers form part of the King's Own Royal Regiment. They would fight in the Battle of the Somme in 1916. 1 in 6 of the regiment would die on the front line. Corporal George Parsonage was one of the lucky survivors.
That's my grandfather, George Parsonage, in the middle, and his best friend, Harold Hodgson. He looks quite cheery. He's smiling there, so obviously he's having a good day. By this time he's become a corporal, and this is his dog, which he brought home with him after the war, called Shrapnel. This is the battalion coming down to the railway station. If we look at what they're carrying here, they've all got their 303 Lee Enfield rifles and the bandoliers around the neck containing their ammunition, their pouches with their first essentials, shaving kit, eating kit, that they wouldn't have at the front line. I would imagine that they were thinking about what they were leaving behind, whether they would see their homes again, and what's ahead of them, what's it going to be like. This is a picture of a staff sergeant having his photograph taken with his daughter, having just moved his son out of the way so that he could possibly have his last photograph before he departs for war. But it's actually quite a moving picture, isn't it? Because that's how dads are like with the daughters. And there is an amount of bravado where we need to be brave, we need to show we're not squeamish or soft. But then equally there's another side that's quite thoughtful and caring. And this is one of those moments.
The pride the men felt going to fight was matched by the people left behind, from small acts of kindness, like collecting blankets for the troops, to the manufacturing of artificial limbs. All of Britain was united in the war effort.
The Edwardians were brilliant at identifying a need and acting quickly to meet that need, whether it's providing a cup of tea at a train station for a soldier passing through on a train, or whether it's a blanket that could be sent out to a guy stationed at a barracks somewhere.
You see what mobilisation means on the ground. Unprecedented in British history, in European history.
Every industry, every worker, everyone who can do something is putting themselves into the war effort.
This is what this film encapsulates, really, with that sort of community spirit that bound people together, and it got Britain through that war. It really did.
In total, 6 million British men went to war. Over 700,000 were killed, and millions more were injured.
My dad's father was a stretcher bearer and went off probably in a train like that at the age of 17. It makes you think about it quite differently.
But you can see there, it's not just because the camera's there, this is an exciting adventure. They're going off to do something different. And for many of them that have been working those 11-hour shifts in factories and not very good conditions, suddenly they're going abroad. So you can imagine how excited they were. Very few would have been trepidatious. They were told, we have more men, more arms than the Germans. This is just a matter of finishing them off and you'll all be back by Christmas. And we all know what happened next. Huge carnage, just to gain 25 yards on the Western Front.
There was a huge enthusiasm for the war in the early days, you know, fighting for king and country and, you know, fighting for a just cause. So people walk off with pride and with a certain sense of being invincible, I think.
These films, like nothing else, reveal how our Edwardian ancestors lived, what they stood for, what they fought for, and what in the end they were prepared to die for.
History tends to be about the rich, the famous, the powerful, the influential. And most of the people that we've been looking at through this film footage are not powerful people. They're ordinary people, and they often get left out of the narrative of history. But this footage is about them.
Better conditions for workers, people's right to vote, people's right to travel, people's right to earn a living wage. All of those things that we still fight for today, the Edwardians fought for and achieved for us. So we shouldn't look at them as a lost generation. We should look at ourselves as their proud descendants, because they gave us modern society.
It's a world that's shown in all its sensory vividness, and you get a better sense of, I think, the beating heart of the Edwardian period by seeing it in colour.